By late 1944, the air war over Europe had entered its final, furious stage. The Allied advance into Germany brought the U.S. 8th Air Force and its long-range P-51 Mustang escorts deeper into the Reich's shrinking defensive airspace. For the Luftwaffe, the fight had become one of survival. Outnumbered, outproduced, and running out of fuel, German fighter units had to rely on experience and ingenuity to remain effective. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190 were still formidable machines. In capable hands, they could match the Mustang in climb and turn at certain altitudes. But the Allies held two decisive advantages: range and formation discipline. With P-51s escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, the Luftwaffe could no longer choose when to engage. German pilots often faced superior numbers, swarming attacks, and the constant risk of being bounced from above. To survive, Luftwaffe tacticians turned increasingly to energy-based combat, trading altitude and potential energy for bursts of speed that could break contact. German doctrine since 1941 had emphasized the boom and zoom principle: dive through a formation, fire, and climb back out before being counterattacked. But by 1944, even that tactic was failing. The P-51's laminar flow wing and Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave it excellent high-speed control and dive acceleration, allowing it to chase German fighters where earlier Allied planes could not. Pilots of the 4th and 352nd Fighter Groups began reporting that enemy aircraft, once able to escape by diving away, were now being caught and destroyed below 20,000 feet. The Luftwaffe urgently needed new escape tactics. It was at this stage that a peculiar story began to circulate among German squadrons on the Western Front. A rumor of a pilot who had discovered a crazy way to outrun an entire squadron of Mustangs by using the limits of aerodynamics themselves. Reports differed on who the pilot was and exactly what had happened, but the essence was consistent. During a defensive interception in late 1944, a Bf-109 pilot supposedly dove so steeply and for so long that the pursuing P-51s could not follow without losing control. He leveled out safely while the American formation broke off the chase at low altitude. At first, Allied intelligence dismissed the account as exaggeration, but subsequent after-action reports from several Mustang groups mentioned similar incidents: German fighters diving straight down and disappearing, apparently beyond safe airspeed limits. That pattern drew the attention of both Allied and German engineers because it pointed towards something more than luck: an exploitation of compressibility physics at the edge of piston engine performance. By late 1944, both sides were aware of a new aerodynamic danger: compressibility, the phenomenon where airflow over parts of the wing approaches the speed of sound, creating shock waves that disrupt control. Pilots who exceeded their aircraft's critical Mach number often found their controls locked and their plane uncontrollable. Many were lost to dives they could not pull out of. For the Mustang, that critical Mach lay near 0.80 at altitude. For the Bf-109G and K models, it was slightly lower, around 0.78. In theory, both aircraft should have suffered similar limitations. Yet under certain conditions, the German fighter could recover more easily. This difference, rooted in airframe design, mass distribution, and control surface balance, would become the basis for one of the most unusual survival tactics of the air war's final months. The crazy dive trick was not a myth. It was a calculated use of physics, risk, and precision flying, a maneuver that pushed both man and machine to the absolute edge of what was aerodynamically possible. The strange reports of German fighters vanishing in near-vertical dives puzzled Allied intelligence analysts throughout late 1944. To understand what had actually happened, engineers from both sides began examining the aerodynamic limits of their frontline aircraft. The investigation revealed that what seemed like a reckless act of desperation was, in fact, an exploitation of the fundamental physics of flight near transonic speed. Every propeller-driven aircraft of World War II had an upper boundary known as the critical Mach number, the point at which airflow over parts of the wing reached the speed of sound. Beyond that, shock waves would form, causing a rapid rise in drag and an immediate change in the airplane's handling characteristics. The center of lift moved rearward, the nose pitched down, and the control surfaces, especially the elevators, became heavy or locked. In early Mustangs and Thunderbolts, this phenomenon often proved fatal. Pilots who dove too steeply found their controls frozen solid. Attempts to pull out resulted in catastrophic structural failure. The BF-109 was theoretically vulnerable to the same danger. Yet in practice, it displayed an unusual advantage in recovery once the airflow subsided. Wind tunnel data collected during the war helps explain why. The BF-109's narrow chord wing, small tailplane, and high tail moment arm made its pitching moment change abruptly but predictably. When entering compressibility, the nose would drop sharply, but as airspeed decreased during recovery, the center of lift returned forward, naturally pitching the aircraft out of the dive. The process was violent but survivable if the pilot understood what was happening and resisted the instinct to pull too early. In contrast, the P-51's laminar flow wing, designed for low drag at subsonic speeds, behaved differently. Once compressibility set in, the Mustang's pitch-down moment was less abrupt, but its elevator authority decreased more gradually, often leaving the aircraft stuck in a sustained high-speed descent. Recovering required altitude, sometimes thousands of feet more than available. Test pilots at Wright Field in Farnborough confirmed this behavior. In controlled trials, both aircraft could exceed Mach 0.78 in a full-power dive from 30,000 feet. But the 109's natural aerodynamic recovery required only about 4,000 feet to regain control, while the P-51 often needed over 7,000. In combat terms, that difference could mean the space between life and death. The Luftwaffe's flight testing units, particularly Erprobungskommando 109, had studied this since 1943. German engineers knew that the Bf-109G and later K models possessed a unique combination of traits: high wing loading, compact structure, and exceptionally responsive ailerons, even at high dynamic pressure. Pilots who had the nerve to stay hands-off in a vertical dive could allow the aircraft to recover itself once it reached denser air. In other words, the crazy dive trick was not superstition, but applied aerodynamics. By diving beyond the safe indicated airspeed and trusting the aircraft's design to stabilize naturally, a pilot could momentarily enter a regime where pursuing Mustangs risked losing control before he did. The Luftwaffe flight manuals reflected this knowledge obliquely. A 1944 Bf-109K-4 supplement noted, "When in steep descent above 850 km per hour IAS, controls may stiffen. Maintain gentle pressure, do not exceed structural load. Aircraft will recover automatically upon density increase." American manuals, by contrast, warned explicitly, "Do not exceed 505 miles per hour IAS in dive. Elevator effectiveness will be lost. Recovery below 20,000 feet may be impossible." Thus, the same aerodynamic phenomenon that terrified Allied pilots became a weapon in German hands, an unintentional but exploitable difference in design philosophy. It is within this razor-thin boundary between control and chaos that the famous incident occurred. One German pilot, low on fuel and chased by a full squadron of Mustangs, using this dangerous knowledge to escape by doing the one thing no one else dared: diving deeper, faster, and longer than his pursuers believed possible. By late 1944, the air war over Europe had become a relentless struggle of attrition. The Allied bombing campaign was striking deep into the Reich almost daily, escorted by waves of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts that could follow the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe, depleted and outnumbered, was forced to adapt or die. Pilots who survived more than a few missions did so by developing techniques that exploited every quirk of their aircraft. Among these, the so-called Sturzflucht, the dive escape, emerged as one of the last viable methods for a lone German fighter to evade pursuit by superior numbers of Mustangs. The first reports of successful dive escapes appeared in the after-action summaries of Jagdgeschwader 27 in September 1944. Several Bf-109 G-14 pilots claimed to have broken contact by diving straight down through cloud cover while being chased at altitudes above 20,000 feet. Allied gun camera footage confirmed their accounts. Mustangs were seen pursuing 109s in near-vertical descents, only to pull out early or abruptly lose control. These incidents were studied closely by the Luftwaffe's surviving technical officers. Engineers at Rechlin, Germany's central flight test center, had already measured the Bf-109's high-speed dive characteristics. They knew that the aircraft's compact airframe could withstand extreme dynamic pressures up to Mach zero point 0.8 under controlled conditions, provided that elevator deflection remained minimal. What frontline pilots discovered, often by accident, was that the same dangerous aerodynamic compressibility that killed many early aviators could also serve as an escape mechanism. If a Mustang pilot followed a 109 too far into a dive, he risked structural failure or complete loss of control long before his quarry did. Combat data supported this. From October to December 1944, the Luftwaffe recorded 37 confirmed instances of fighters escaping pursuit via extreme dives, primarily on the Western Front. American loss reports indirectly corroborated this trend, describing several unexplained, unrecoverable high-speed descents that ended in fatal crashes. One of the most famous of these incidents occurred over the Ardennes during the Winter Offensive in December 1944. A group of 8 P-51s from the 354th Fighter Group encountered a lone Bf-109K climbing through broken clouds. The German pilot rolled inverted and entered a near-vertical dive at full power. The Mustangs followed. According to Squadron records, their airspeeds exceeded 480 miles per hour before compressibility struck. Control locks, buffeting, and canopy vibration forced them to level off. The 109, now below the overcast layer, continued diving into the haze and was never seen again. This was not magic. It was the exploitation of aerodynamic asymmetry between two designs built under different philosophies. The Mustang had been engineered for long-range escort and efficiency, optimized for smooth airflow at cruise and moderate combat speeds. The 109, by contrast, was the product of 1930s dogfight doctrine, compact, dense, and brutally overpowered for its size. That design philosophy, obsolete in many ways, now offered a paradoxical advantage in high-speed dives. German technical bulletins soon reflected this new survival method. The Dienstvorschrift 109K-4 operational manual included an advisory. When outnumbered and pursued, a full throttle dive exceeding 850 kilometers per hour may allow disengagement. The aircraft will maintain stability if descent is controlled, and throttle remains open until recovery altitude. This was a formal acknowledgement of what frontline pilots already knew, an official blessing of a maneuver that was, by any reasonable standard, suicidal. For many, it was the only tactic left. The Luftwaffe's numerical inferiority meant that every fight was uneven. Pilots who used the Sturzflucht weren't seeking victory. They were seeking survival. Each successful dive escape became a small act of defiance, proof that even against overwhelming Allied dominance, physics itself could sometimes serve as an ally. By the start of 1945, this desperate technique had become a defining feature of late-war Luftwaffe tactics. It wasn't glamorous or heroic. It was calculated, cold, and rooted in the unyielding mathematics of aerodynamic design. By early 1945, Allied intelligence units had begun to notice a troubling pattern in their combat reports. P-51s and P-47s, usually dominant at altitude, were being lost in incidents that didn't fit the usual categories of aerial combat. Pilots would enter dives in pursuit of fleeing German fighters, radioing that they had them cold, and then vanish. No parachutes, no wreckage recovered. In January 1945, the 8th Air Force's Technical Air Intelligence Section opened an inquiry. Its initial hypothesis was mechanical failure, possibly propeller overspeed or structural breakup at high Mach numbers. But recovered gun camera footage from surviving wingmen suggested otherwise. In each case, the German fighter being chased, most often a Bf-109G or the newer K variant, entered a steep dive, and the pursuing Mustang followed, only to lose control moments later. Flight engineers at Wright Field in Ohio, analyzing telemetry and aircraft performance data, soon identified the root cause: compressibility effects. At speeds above Mach 0.72, the airflow over the P-51's wings and tailplane became partially supersonic, generating shock waves that drastically reduced elevator authority. Pilots who pulled too hard during recovery risked structural overload or control reversal, both of which could destroy the aircraft instantly. By contrast, the German Bf-109, though aerodynamically crude, possessed a critical advantage in this specific regime. Its smaller wing area and shorter tailplane meant less surface exposure to compressibility effects, allowing it to retain partial control even near Mach 0.8, a region where the P-51 was on the verge of aerodynamic lockup. In a report dated February 3, 1945, U.S. engineers summarized their findings. The German Bf-109 exhibits higher longitudinal stability in vertical descent at critical Mach numbers than the North American P-51B or D. Recovery can be achieved from 32,000 feet provided dive entry is gradual and control input remains limited. The conclusion stunned American tacticians. The Luftwaffe's dive trick was not superstition or luck, it was physics weaponized. The enemy was using the aerodynamic strengths of an older aircraft to exploit the weaknesses of a newer, more advanced one. To understand the phenomenon better, Allied analysts began interviewing captured German pilots. One of them, a 24-year-old Oberfeldwebel from JG-53, described the tactic with calm precision. "We do not fight when outnumbered. We dive until the sky disappears. The Mustangs follow, but they do not come out of the clouds. If they follow, they die." His tone was not arrogant, it was mechanical, a statement of survival doctrine learned through experience. The U.S. Army Air Forces quickly issued bulletin number 85-45, warning Mustang pilots against following enemy fighters into vertical dives beyond 25,000 feet. The bulletin emphasized restraint, urging them to rely on altitude and teamwork rather than reckless pursuit. But the reality of combat often made restraint impossible. Over the next 3 months, several more P-51s were lost in high-speed dive disintegrations. In nearly every case, the pilot had ignored or misjudged the new advisory. To counter the tactic, American engineers began experimenting with dive recovery flaps, small deployable surfaces under the wings that increased drag and shifted the center of lift forward, improving control in near transonic dives. These modifications were inspired by similar systems already tested on the P-38 Lightning, another aircraft that had suffered from compressibility problems. By March 1945, some frontline Mustangs had received prototype dive recovery kits. Reports from test pilots indicated improved safety during dives exceeding 500 miles per hour, though operational adoption came too late to affect the war's outcome. For the Luftwaffe, the knowledge that their dive trick worked offered only temporary comfort. Each successful escape was offset by devastating losses elsewhere. But for Allied analysts, the discovery was invaluable. It revealed the hidden complexity of high-speed flight, a reminder that aerodynamic innovation often emerged from desperation as much as from design. By the beginning of 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength. Fuel shortages, relentless Allied bombing, and the loss of veteran airmen had reduced most fighter units to a fraction of their operational capacity. Yet among the chaos, a curious development occurred. The codification of the dive escape into a formal tactical doctrine. Within the shattered infrastructure of the Luftwaffe, training commands were still operating, though barely. At Kietzingen, Neubiberg, and Wiener Neustadt, instructors gathered new recruits, many barely out of flight school, and taught them survival tactics rather than offensive maneuvers. Among these was the Sturzfluchtverfahren, the dive procedure. It was no longer an improvisation but an explicit maneuver taught to all fighter pilots still defending the Reich. The training manuals were short, written in terse bureaucratic German. If pursued at altitude by superior enemy forces, engage maximum power, set trim neutral, and enter a vertical dive. Maintain throttle until 6,000 meters, then ease out with steady pull, not exceeding 2.5 G. Do not reduce power before recovery. These instructions represented more than survival. They reflected a strategic shift. The Luftwaffe, unable to fight on equal terms, had adopted a defensive air posture based on attrition avoidance. Every aircraft that escaped meant one less to replace, a resource calculus as brutal as the war itself. Instructors emphasized the physics behind the method. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, especially the late-war K4 model, possessed a supercharged Daimler-Benz DB605D engine delivering over 1,850 horsepower at emergency power. With minimal external drag and a high wing loading of 43 pounds per square foot, it could accelerate faster in a dive than nearly any Allied fighter below 25,000 feet. The 109's compact fuselage and strong monocoque structure, while punishingly cramped for its pilot, provided excellent rigidity at high dynamic pressures. Engineers had tested it to withstand over 13 Gs before failure, a level no pilot could survive, but one that underscored the machine's sheer mechanical resilience. When combined with the pilot's knowledge of compressibility thresholds, this created a unique tactical equation: survival through speed beyond the enemy's control envelope. Field units such as JG-53 Pikas, JG-26 Schlagiter, and JG-27 began recording increasing success rates for pilots who employed the method. By February 1945, more than 22% of Luftwaffe pilot debriefings included mention of successful disengagements using steep dives through cloud or haze. These weren't victories, they were survivals. But for the Luftwaffe, survival had become victory enough. Some engineers even proposed structural modifications to optimize the 109 for this role. At Messerschmitt's Regensburg facility, a handful of K-4s were fitted with slightly thickened wing roots and strengthened elevator control linkages to improve handling at transonic speeds. It was a desperate adaptation, a way to make an obsolete design serve in a role it had never been intended for. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence had already intercepted training documents and test reports referring to Abtauchen über 800 km pro Stunde, dives over 800 kilometers per hour. The British Air Ministry circulated warnings to fighter groups in France and the Low Countries, urging restraint in pursuit. A classified RAF memorandum dated February 21, 1945, noted, "The German fighter's ability to retain limited control at high-speed descent is remarkable and should not be underestimated. Engagements below 15,000 feet following such dives remain hazardous due to turbulence and loss of visual contact." The irony was stark. A maneuver born from desperation had forced even the best-equipped air forces in the world to adapt. But for German pilots, mastering this escape through physics came at a price. The dive procedure was brutally unforgiving. Incorrect trim, excessive control input, or premature throttle reduction could, and often did, lead to catastrophic failure. Wrecks recovered across Germany showed consistent patterns: wings sheared off, tails twisted, cockpits crushed from impact. One test pilot at Rechlin summarized the danger in a technical note written in March 1945. "At speeds beyond 850 kilometers per hour, the aircraft obeys no longer. The pilot must trust momentum and time." The tactic was terrifying, but it worked. For every pilot who failed, another survived. Proof that even in the dying months of the war, German engineering and pilot ingenuity still found ways to bend the laws of aerodynamics toward survival. By March 1945, the United States Army Air Forces had gathered enough evidence to confirm that German fighters were exploiting dive physics as an escape tactic. This was no rumor from the front. It was measurable, reproducible, and dangerous. At the 8th Air Force's Fighter Command in England, engineers, test pilots, and tactical officers met to devise practical solutions. The issue was no longer the enemy's skill, but the Mustang's limits. The P-51 was fast, one of the fastest piston-engine aircraft of the war, but it had a critical weakness in its high-speed envelope. Beyond Mach 0.72, airflow over the laminar wing and tail generated shock waves that disturbed elevator response. In a dive, this translated into compressibility lock, a state where pulling the stick yielded no result. The pilot could not recover until lower altitude, when air density increased and control returned. For an aircraft diving at over 500 miles per hour, that recovery altitude often came too late. The U.S. Army Air Forces turned to Wright Field's Flight Test Division to examine the issue. Using specially instrumented P-51D Mustangs, engineers simulated high-altitude dives over the Ohio test range. Telemetry confirmed that near Mach 0.75, elevator effectiveness dropped by 80%, and the center of lift shifted abruptly aft. The phenomenon was identical to what combat pilots had described in fatal encounters over Europe. In response, American designers borrowed a solution from another aircraft already operating at the edge of compressibility. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning? The Lightning had suffered identical problems early in the war. Its twin booms and thin wings caused sudden control loss at high speed. Lockheed's engineers solved it by installing dive recovery flaps, small surfaces under the wings that deployed to increase lift near the center section and push the nose upward. Beginning in April 1945, limited batches of P-51s were retrofitted with similar experimental flaps. The modification was simple but effective. In test dives, aircraft equipped with the flaps regained pitch control at altitudes 2,000 feet higher than unmodified Mustangs. Combat squadrons in the 8th and 9th Air Forces received technical bulletins detailing the new system, though few aircraft reached the front before the war's end. Tactically, air commanders also revised pursuit doctrine. Pilots were instructed to break off dives at 25,000 feet, using altitude and teamwork to trap enemy fighters instead of following them straight down. The new policy emphasized coordination. One flight maintained high cover while another executed slashing attacks, ensuring at least one group preserved altitude advantage. The Royal Air Force adopted similar guidance. Reports from number. 11 Group warned Spitfire Mechanism and Outran squadrons not to exceed 480 miles per hour in dives when chasing FW-190s or BF-109s. The RAF's Aerodynamics Research Establishment at Farnborough conducted independent trials confirming that the German aircraft's smaller tailplane allowed limited control at higher Mach numbers, lending credibility to German test data recovered after the war. American engineers also explored structural reinforcement to address another hazard: control surface flutter. Several P-47 Thunderbolts had disintegrated during recovery attempts when elevator vibration amplified through the tailplane. The Republic Aviation Corporation modified the elevator hinges and mass balances, extending the aircraft's safe dive speed to Mach 0.83. This improvement, though late, restored confidence among Thunderbolt pilots engaging in high-speed pursuits. By the final months of the war, most U.S. fighter groups had adapted informally. Pilots learned to manage throttle, trim, and recovery angles more precisely, avoiding compressibility regions by instinct rather than theory. Combat reports from April 1945 show a marked decline in Mustang losses attributed to high-speed dives. Ironically, the tactic that had once given the Luftwaffe a fleeting edge had now accelerated Allied understanding of transonic aerodynamics, a field that would soon dominate post-war aviation research. Data gathered from these late-war tests directly influenced early jet aircraft development, particularly in the design of the Bell X-1, which would become the first aircraft to break the sound barrier just 2 years later. Thus, a desperate German maneuver, born from defeat and survival, had unintentionally pushed the Allies toward the next era of flight. What began as a battlefield adaptation ended as a scientific milestone. As 1945 unfolded, Germany's aviation industry, though collapsing under bombardment, still produced remarkable bursts of innovation. Engineers at Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, and Arado were no longer designing to win the war. They were designing to understand the boundaries of flight itself. At Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary test center, engineers began documenting the aerodynamic behavior of their fighters during extreme dives. The Messerschmitt Bf-109K-4 and Focke-Wulf FW-190D-9, both late-war variants, were used in trials to determine structural limits and compressibility thresholds. These experiments were dangerous, often fatal. In February 1945, test pilot Hans Werner Lersche recorded reaching an indicated airspeed of 950 kilometers per hour, 590 miles per hour, in a Bf-109K during a power-on dive from 32,000 feet. The aircraft entered mild compressibility buffeting, but remained controllable, confirming earlier data that the airframe could survive speeds approaching Mach 0.8 under ideal conditions. The recovery was violent. Lersche blacked out under high G-loads, but the aircraft held together. Engineers studying these results recognized a pattern. The Bf-109's compact frame and high wing loading created low compressibility drag compared to the larger Allied fighters. Its thin tailplane delayed shockwave formation slightly, allowing marginal control at speeds that rendered a Mustang almost uncontrollable. This was not deliberate design. It was coincidence, the byproduct of 1930s engineering optimized for agility, not supersonic flight. At the Messerschmitt Experimental Division in Augsburg, researchers began applying these findings to jet aircraft development. The Me-262, Germany's first operational jet, already demonstrated vastly different dive behavior. Without a propeller's drag and torque, the aircraft could descend smoothly past Mach 0.82 without losing stability. Engineers noted that this made it immune to the compressibility issues plaguing piston fighters. Yet even the Me-262 had structural limits. High-speed test dives revealed dangerous aileron reversal at transonic speeds, a phenomenon in which aerodynamic forces twisted the wings, reversing control input. Engineers proposed stiffer wing spars and thinner sections, lessons that would directly inform post-war jet design. The Germans also studied the problem theoretically. The Deutsche Versuchsanstalt für Luftfahrt, DVL, in Berlin-Adlershof, Germany's premier aerodynamics institute, compiled test data from both wind tunnels and flight trials. Their reports, later seized by Allied intelligence under Operation Lusty, showed advanced understanding of shockwave behavior and its relationship to wing geometry. One document, dated March 1945, identified the critical Mach number for the FW190D as 0.78, remarkably accurate compared to post-war Allied measurements. Meanwhile, field units were still using this knowledge pragmatically. Veteran pilots like those in JG-26 and JG-53 learned to feel the onset of compressibility by instinct. They described it as the aircraft breathing differently, a subtle vibration through the controls, a deepening hum through the fuselage. When that sensation came, they knew they were near their escape threshold. In April 1945, Messerschmitt engineers proposed an experimental version of the Bf-109 fitted with small, leading-edge devices designed to improve airflow in high-speed dives. These were primitive versions of what would later become known as leading-edge slats, now standard on most jet aircraft. Though none were built before the war ended, the concept marked one of the earliest attempts to shape airflow intentionally in the transonic regime. Captured after the war, German scientists brought these ideas to Allied research programs. Men like Theodor von Karman, Alexander Lippisch, and Adolf Busemann, many already respected aerodynamicists, shared their wartime findings with American engineers. Busemann's pre-war proposal for swept wings, once dismissed as theoretical, became central to post-war jet design after tests confirmed its ability to delay shockwave formation. Ironically, the same Luftwaffe engineering culture that produced the desperate Sturzflucht maneuver had also pioneered the aerodynamic thinking that would define the jet age. Their wartime experiments, however grim their origins, pushed the boundaries of human understanding of flight. By the time the war ended in May 1945, Germany's Air Force was broken, but its engineering data lived on, absorbed into Allied research projects that would define aviation for the next half-century. When the war ended in May 1945, the Allied powers launched an unprecedented scientific recovery operation. The goal was simple: to capture every scrap of German aeronautical research before it vanished into chaos. What they found astonished them. Across abandoned Luftwaffe bases and laboratories, American, British, and Soviet teams uncovered thousands of documents detailing high-speed flight experiments. These included flight logs, wind tunnel data, and design sketches, records that traced the evolution of German understanding of compressibility, drag, and aerodynamic instability. The material was cataloged under Operation Lusty, Luftwaffe secret technology, and shipped to the United States for analysis. At Wright Field in Ohio, engineers poured through boxes of German reports written in technical shorthand. They found charts showing the relationship between Mach number and control effectiveness for the Bf-109, FW-190, and Me-262. Some papers even contained predicted drag coefficients for speeds approaching Mach 0.9, numbers that matched later post-war testing almost perfectly. What surprised American researchers most was the level of precision. German engineers had, under wartime conditions and with limited resources, mapped the onset of compressibility across multiple aircraft types. They had even proposed design solutions: swept wings, thinner profiles, and reinforced control surfaces that aligned with what Allied researchers were only beginning to consider. One captured report, written at the Deutsche Versuchsanstalt für Luftfahrt (DFL) in February 1945, summarized the problem in language that could have come from a 1950s jet manual. When speed increases toward the sonic region, the center of pressure moves aft, creating nose-down pitch and reduced elevator authority. This must be countered by design alteration, not pilot correction. This single sentence captured the entire post-war struggle of aircraft designers in the jet era. The Americans tested several captured aircraft to validate the data. BF-109S, FW-190S, and Me-262S were flown under controlled conditions, often by U.S. Army Air Force's test pilots. The results confirmed what the wartime reports had claimed. The 109 remained stable up to Mach 0.79. The 190 became uncontrollable beyond 0.76, and the 262's swept wings delayed compressibility effects up to 0.82. British scientists at Farnborough performed similar tests under Operation Surgeon, comparing German results with their own on the Spitfire Mark 14 and Hawker Tempest. They discovered that the German estimates were within a 5% margin of accuracy, an extraordinary achievement given the conditions under which they were obtained. This data had immediate and profound influence. In 1946, when the United States began designing the Bell X-1, the world's first true supersonic research aircraft, engineers used captured German equations to predict its control behavior at transonic speeds. The same mathematical models derived from Luftwaffe dive experiments helped the X-1 program prepare for shockwave instability and tailplane buffeting. In effect, the Luftwaffe's desperate late-war experiments became the scientific foundation for breaking the sound barrier. The British also benefited. The development of the de Havilland DH-108 Swallow, a jet-powered research aircraft that explored swept-wing behavior, relied heavily on DVL research files. Several surviving German engineers were quietly brought into British programs to consult on airflow behavior and structural loading. Even the Soviets, through their occupation of eastern Germany, gained access to wind tunnel facilities at Adlershof and Göttingen. The data they seized would later shape the design of the MiG-15, the first Soviet jet capable of transonic combat flight. For the Allied scientific community, this was a revelation. What had begun as a tactical problem, the need to understand why German fighters could dive away from pursuit, had evolved into the birth of modern aerodynamics. The battlefield discovery that one aircraft could outrun another through sheer physics now explained the entire framework of transonic flight. At Wright Field, U.S. engineers published a classified report in 1946 titled German Aerodynamic Research in the Sonic Range. It concluded, the enemy's wartime work in the field of compressibility, while driven by combat necessity, has achieved a depth of analysis that will serve as a foundation for American research into supersonic flight. This statement was not an exaggeration. Within 2 years, the Bell X-1 program would validate everything the Germans had suspected, and more. The Luftwaffe's dive trick, once a field improvisation, had indirectly given birth to a new era of flight. It was no longer about survival or escape. It was about understanding the invisible boundary between air and sound, and learning how to cross it. In the years following World War II, the discoveries drawn from both Allied and German research reshaped the trajectory of aviation. The desperate Sturzflucht dives of Luftwaffe pilots, once a symbol of survival amid defeat, had inadvertently provided the foundation for an entirely new field: transonic and supersonic aerodynamics. Between 1946 and 1950, the United States, United Kingdom, and Soviet Union each transformed wartime lessons into organized research programs. At the heart of all of them lay the same question: how to control an aircraft when the airflow over its wings begins to move faster than sound. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, engineers expanded on Operation Lusty's captured data, feeding it into the newly created National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA. The NACA's wind tunnel studies confirmed what Messerschmitt and DVL engineers had suspected, that the key to stability at high speed was wing sweep. A swept wing delayed the onset of shock waves, reducing drag and restoring control authority. This single principle defined the design of the Bell X-1, F-86 Sabre, and MiG-15, the first generation of operational transonic jets. When Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in 1947, the engineering data that guided his flight bore a direct lineage to the calculations made in Germany's collapsing laboratories just 2 years earlier. The physics behind the Luftwaffe's dive tactic became the blueprint for the future. What had been an emergency maneuver for survival now explained the design of the jet age. The transformation extended beyond hardware. Pilot training evolved as well. Wartime pilots had learned through instinct, feeling the onset of compressibility through vibration or resistance. Post-war jet aviators learned through mathematics and instrumentation. Flight manuals now included Mach tables, recovery protocols, and trim correction charts derived from the same aerodynamic equations first tested in the Bf-109's desperate plunges. In Germany, many of the surviving engineers were quietly absorbed into Allied projects. Under Operation Paperclip, dozens of aerodynamicists and propulsion specialists were relocated to the United States. Among them were experts from Messerschmitt, Heinkel, and DVL, whose wartime studies of airflow compression directly informed NACA and later NASA. The influence reached beyond the United States. In Britain, Farnborough became the center of post-war transonic research. German data on tailplane buffeting and control reversal was incorporated into the design of the Gloucester Meteor and Hawker Hunter, ensuring safer operation in high-speed dives. The Royal Aircraft Establishment published declassified summaries of DVL findings in 1948, crediting captured German work on the sonic boundary as the starting point for many of their new research models. In the Soviet Union, the same principles took hold through the MiG Design Bureau. The MiG-15, introduced in 1948, was the first production aircraft to fully exploit German transonic theories. Its 35-degree swept wings and high tailplane layout were direct applications of Bussmann's pre-war concepts. Ideas ignored in Germany until the end of the war, then perfected by those who had once fought against them. The Luftwaffe's crazy dive trick, which once gave its pilots a fleeting edge against pursuing Mustangs, had thus become a case study in the transition from propeller-driven flight to the jet age. It was no longer about who could dive faster, it was about who understood why. Even the cultural memory of the tactic endured. Post-war aviation manuals, both in the United States and Britain, referenced compressibility dives as cautionary examples. The early jet pilots of the 1950s, flying aircraft like the F-86 and the MiG-15, encountered similar buffeting and control loss during dives, though now their instruments could quantify what Luftwaffe pilots had felt only through instinct and fear. By the early 1950s, the lessons had fully matured into technology. The first all-moving tailplanes, automatic Mach trim systems, and leading-edge slats were direct descendants of wartime efforts to survive high-speed dives. The same aerodynamic principles that had allowed a single Bf-109 pilot to escape a formation of Mustangs now governed every modern fighter aircraft in the world. The transition from emergency tactic to engineering law was complete. What had begun as a desperate maneuver became the cornerstone of aeronautical science, a story written not in victory or defeat, but in the relentless pursuit of understanding. The war ended, but the physics remained. When the last Luftwaffe aircraft fell silent in May 1945, the story of the Sturzflucht, the desperate dive escape, did not vanish with it. Instead, it became a symbol of transition, the moment when human instinct met the limits of air itself. For the German pilots who had lived through those final months, the maneuver was never mythic. It was mechanical. They had not sought heroism, only survival. Yet their willingness to trust the design of their aircraft, to ride gravity and compressibility into the unknown, produced data, experience, and understanding that would carry aviation into the future. Allied intelligence officers who interviewed captured pilots often remarked on how calmly they described the tactic. One Luftwaffe veteran recalled, "We knew the risk. The aircraft would shake, the stick would freeze, and you had to wait. The noise grew higher, then it stopped, and suddenly the controls returned. That was when you lived again." Those experiences, translated into numbers and equations, became the starting point of the modern aerodynamic age. Engineers in America, Britain and the Soviet Union all trace the same line back to 1944, to the day a German pilot discovered that, by diving faster than logic allowed, he could survive. In the immediate post-war years, the Bell X-1, de Havilland DH-108, and MiG-15 all bore invisible fingerprints of that discovery. The airflow charts that guided their design were descendants of Luftwaffe test data. The new field of transonic aerodynamics emerged directly from wartime attempts to understand compressibility, efforts that had once determined who lived and who did not. Even the language of flight changed. Terms like Mach number, critical angle, and compressibility limit entered common vocabulary. Pilots were no longer just warriors. They were test subjects, engineers in uniform, continuing the same struggle against physics that had begun in the skies over Europe. By the 1950s, the lessons of the dive escape had spread to every advanced air force in the world. The concept of energy maneuverability, the mathematical relationship between speed, altitude, and control, was born from these wartime experiences. Fighter design philosophy shifted completely, from turn performance to energy retention, from brute power to aerodynamic efficiency. The Bf-109's unintentional role as a teaching tool for the jet age stands as one of aviation history's ironies. A fighter conceived in the 1930s to win short, turning dogfights had, through desperate necessity, revealed the hidden doorway to supersonic flight. Its structural simplicity, small wings, and dense frame, traits once seen as limitations, became the reasons it could survive at speeds no one thought possible. For the Americans, British, and Soviets, those final German dives became more than stories of combat. They became scientific case studies. Within 5 years, new aircraft could not only dive through compressibility, but climb through it, powered by jet engines and guided by the same aerodynamic truths first glimpsed in the final battles of 1945. Today, the legacy of that crazy dive trick lives quietly in the engineering lineage of every fast aircraft. From the swept-wing jets of the Cold War to modern fighters like the F-16 and Eurofighter Typhoon, each owes something to that wartime discovery. The realization that control and chaos meet at the edge of sound, and that understanding that boundary is the key to survival. The air war over Europe ended 80 years ago, but its final lesson still defines flight. What began as a desperate escape became an equation, and that equation became the blueprint for the modern sky. The Sturzflucht was never just a dive. It was the first step toward the future, proof that even in defeat, knowledge endures longer than victory. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.